Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. We had some minor technical problems because this is high technology in which I'm not very fluent. What I want to have is actually a PowerPoint with videos in between, but somehow because of the software it doesn't work. So halfway, every now and then I will go out of PowerPoint to show you short pieces of video, but I think we'll manage. What I want to discuss with you today is not just the history of Maidan, but I think what is important is to discuss the significance of Maidan and the position of Maidan in history, and what kind of effect this is going to have on the future situation in the former Soviet Union and on the European continent. And it's a story I will tell you from a personal involvement, having been there on a very regular basis, having seen what meaning it is, and especially what kind of energy the whole situation there has evoked. And I'm not very much going into detail with regards to the war which is currently being waged in eastern Ukraine. There will be a little bit about it in the end, but if you open Facebook, you know exactly what is going on. Slavyansk has been taken, Kramatorsk has been taken. Basically, there are two big towns which are still being occupied by the terrorists, Luhansk and Donetsk. And interestingly, people who disappeared in Slavyansk, like one of the pilots of the Ukrainian Air Force, winds up in the Quid-Pro prison in Voronezh, being under accusation of murder. So it's a very interesting way in which Russia is not involved but is involved. When giving a presentation, I'm very much involved in mental health care issues, and a psychiatric conference always starts with declaration of your interest, which means mostly that you say whether you're involved in the pharmaceutical industry or not. Well, my declaration of interest is very much involved in being part of the whole human rights campaign in the former Soviet Union. I've been involved since 1977, so for more than 35 years. Still involved in a lot of NGOs working with regards to human rights in the Soviet Union, and I'm also teaching Soviet and post-Soviet studies here at Ilia. Some of the examples of my activities. I've revamped a foundation which we used to have in the 1980s, the Vladimir Bukovsky Foundation. It's now called the Foundation Иностранный агент, which is dealing with the human rights situation in the former Soviet Union. One of the fundraising ways is to have our own vodka, which is now on sale, vodka Иностранный агент. 10% of the turnover goes to the foundation. So the more you drink, the more free you become, right? And sometimes we also create t-shirts, like this one here on the left-hand side is one of the most recent ones, Putin Khoilo, which is nicely in the Coca-Cola style. More seriously, we are now putting out every quarter a list of political prisoners in the Russian Federation. And I will come back to this list because the list very much indicates how much the situation in the Soviet Union or in Russia has deteriorated. I've been involved in Ukrainian issues since 1990, so for almost 25 years. We had our own publishing house in Ukraine, we had our own publishing press, an old Heidelberg, which published more than 100 books. And I've had all kinds of functions, mostly kind of semi-official or unofficial on behalf of Ukraine, trying to help the country to get off the ground and establish itself. And the importance in connection with Maidan is that, for 23 years, this was a country which, people had a Ukrainian passport, but at the same time they said, I'm Ukrainian, what does it mean? Right? Some of the people in the West had a very strong national feeling towards Ukraine, but in general, it's a country which just by coincidence happened to exist. And nobody really felt this connection to the country. If you now go to Ukraine, it's totally different. Ukraine has been born basically with Maidan, and people feel a very strong connection to this. And you will see in practice that a lot of the successes that they have right now at the front is only because the population is supporting the effort. So we're looking at a combination of two countries, the standoff between which is very much the front line between the European Union and what is left of the Soviet Union. And here you get into one of the first fundamental mistakes that people in the West make. They think that the Soviet Union ceased to exist 23 years ago. It didn't. The Soviet Union is there, and it's there in full force. I lived part of the time in Lithuania. If I look out of my window, 70% of what I see is the Soviet Union. It's there, maybe not as a name, not physically, but mentality-wise, organization-wise, it is still very much there. And one of the countries, or the main country, which embodies this continuation of Sovietism is Russia, which is a country where we see an increased authoritarianism, increased repression. One of my colleagues in Moscow is now working on a list of the new laws which have been introduced over the past 3 years, repressive laws, and he goes crazy because there are even more than he can imagine. And those who remember Soviet times, there used to be this Article 58 in Stalin times, which basically anything you did was liable to be resulting in a criminal case against you. If you see the collection of laws now being introduced in the Russian Federation, basically Article 58 is back. It's just in all separate kind of entities, right? And then, as I said, Ukraine, a country which nobody expected to be, and I remember in the early 1990s, when trying to explain to the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs that there's actually a country, Ukraine, which has a capital, Kiev, and Kiev is not Russia, they would say, well, what do we care? In a couple of years it will be Russia again, so why waste our energies on supporting Ukraine in becoming independent? My presentation today has a number of main messages. Right? Because in a way this is the message of Maidan, as I perceive it. Message number one is Russia is ruled by a criminal gang. It's a criminal state, right? And there's a lot of cover-up, and this whole facade of statism, but in fact we are just looking at a pretty criminal entity. I'm wondering that maybe the lights up here could go down a little bit, because it's a very nice photo, right? And the interesting thing is that Putin and his guys all the time are telling that, well, we saved Russia from Yeltsinism. Yeltsin created turned it into a big, corrupt, dilapidated country, and we reinstated the country that is. In reality, the country is much more corrupt now than it ever was under Yeltsin. Corruption is the central part. The only difference is that now it's the Putin gang which is corrupt and gets the money instead of the situation that you had in the Yeltsin time. We know a lot about Putin's background. First of all, Gubeznik, of course, 16 years old, goes to the KGB, asks them to hire him as a KGB agent, and they send him home because he's too young. So then, the last years in school, he tries really hard to show to the KGB that he's a good Gubeznik, and eventually, apparently he's convincing, and he's taken in the organization. And, in a way, as a KGB agent, he is not only shorty, but he is also mediocre in quality, right? And I think this mediocrity is very much an issue with Putin in the way he presents himself. Because he clearly has an inferiority complex, and he tries to compensate it by showing his torso all the time and being extremely good in finding urns from Greek times somewhere in the sea, or flying on cranes or whatever. He's really the macho first class. But actually there are lots of photos of him as the assistant to Sabchak, then the mayor of St. Petersburg, and most of the time his main task is carrying the bag. Right? It's another image of Putin. It's not a fake photo actually. It shows a little bit the psychology. He went to a photo shoot organized by Time magazine because they wanted to put him on the cover. This is how he was presenting himself. Food for psychologists. So in the country you see that over the years issues of nepotism and clanism has developed enormously. And there are all the time jokes on Facebook about to what extent this has happened. Every kid turns into a small Medvedev, and all the old women turn into a Putin. What is important is that these jokes are now gone. These are jokes from 2012, 2013, and with Maidan and the developing war between the two countries, people stop laughing. It's not funny anymore because of the sense of fear within society that has developed. And if you know what kind of laws are now coming as to confidentiality in the internet, that everything needs to be on Russian servers and the FSB will have full access to all your passwords and God knows what, people are really becoming kind of hesitant to make any jokes on internet. One of the jokes of the old days, 90% of the Russians live in stress and the rest lives outside. Right? And as I said, an enormous number of laws, one after the other, that are being introduced. One of the most important ones, or well-known ones, is the law on the foreign agent, which is the cause why we started the vodka in Estonia again. But actually, if you look at the current situation, to be called a foreign agent in Russia is, oh, thank God, I'm not Pятая колонна, and I'm not a народный предатель, right? So things have really deteriorated immensely since. Political abuse in psychiatry is back. This is still one of the jokes from last year. The Putin dancing as a ballerina in a psychiatric ward. Okay, just go back to your work, right? But it's something which really shows to what extent the Soviet Union is back in full force. And then if you look at the press in Russia, I think what we are now looking at is the last stages before there is total control over the media. In fact, apart from social media, which is still trying to struggle to survive, there are only 3 outlets left which have not yet been taken down. One is Dost, the television channel, has lost 80% of its range and its income and is about to be closed down. The second is Echo Moskwy, which already has a different chief editor, and they're just waiting for the moment when he starts closing it down. And Moscow Times, which is a newspaper which is mainly, focusing on the diaspora. For the rest, everything is already governmental controlled, right? So you have this massive bombardment of propaganda which is entering the heads of people in Russia and is entering the heads of people in eastern Ukraine. And I think this is one of the key elements of Putin's strength. As I said, political prisoners. We published our first list of political prisoners in Russia in January. We had 52 then. Several weeks ago, we published the next list, already 92. Right? And we will be publishing it every quarter. And now we get into a very interesting situation. As I mentioned, this Ukrainian pilot is now in the pre-trial prison in Voronezh. There is a Ukrainian filmmaker from Crimea who is in Lefortovo prison in Moscow. There are 400 people in prison in the Crimea for refusing a Russian passport. So the number of political prisoners is, it's increasing very, very quickly now. Over the years, we've seen in Russia an increasing level of anger and ridicule. And as I mentioned, for a while it was very much kind of encapsulated in joking on the social media. And Russians are very good at self-criticism and joking about themselves. Usually with Russians the thing is that they are allowed to joke as much as they want. Only you as non-Russians should not joke about them because then they don't like it. But you can laugh along with them about the jokes. And these are some of the jokes about Putin and Medvedev. I very much like the one Tretий срок, It's the third presidential term of Putin, and of course turned into the Tretji Srok as a third prison term. And then, very much starting this year, when Maidan turned into something really a threat to the regime, not just in Kiev, but to the regime in Moscow, you get this whole kind of Stalinist attack on society, dubbing everybody who is supporting Maidan or who is against the occupation and annexation of Crimea into well, things that we haven't seen since Stalinist times, right? Pjotr Kolonna, the fifth column, Narodi Predatel, people's traitors. And for instance, there on the right-hand side, this is a big banner hanging out from Dom Knigi in Moscow on Novi Arbat, which is one of the biggest bookstores in Moscow. And it says, strangers are among us, the fifth column. And it faces all well-known people in Russian arts and pop music, like Rebenchikov, like Makarevich. They are dubbed as the fifth column in society and as people's traitors. At the same time, we see that what Putin has been creating over the past years is not just a volcano. Russia in itself is a volcano, but what he has been doing all the time is putting more oil on the fire. And it's a very fascist way of dealing with problems. Okay. It's a very fascist way of dealing with problems because, you could say the Hitlerite conception, in order to build a nation, a Volksgemeinschaft, you need to have enemies. You need to have an external enemy, but you also need to have an internal enemy, right? Well, the external enemy for Russia is clear. It's the Judeo-Banderovцы in Ukraine, right? The internal enemy is multifaceted. It's the fifth column, but it's also issues like national minorities, like the Islam, which is really a fear on the side of the Russians that they will, in 5-10 years from now, they will be a minority in their own country. And in a way, this is something that is very much stimulated by the Putinist regime. One thing that is an important factor is the role of the Russian Orthodox Church. Because here you get a very strange combination of the state and the church becoming actually one and the same. And there are very virulent Russian Orthodox thinkers who actually think that Russia should not only return to its borders of 1913, but everybody should be compulsorily changed into a Russian Orthodox, which automatically solves the whole Islam problem, right? If we're all Russian Orthodox, then we don't have an Islam problem anymore. And it's, additionally interesting because you have a state which is run by Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who is a KGB officer. You have a church which is run by a guy called Vladimir Gundyaev, who usually goes by the name Patriarch Kirill, who is also KGB, right? So we have two KGB guys at the top of and church and state, and they very nicely work together because they understand each other. They speak the same language. Anti-Semitism and racism. The one on the left is a very, nice indicator of the deformation of understanding. Because the idea is actually among part of the Russian nationalists that Vladimir Putin is an agent of world Zionism, right? World Zionism is out to destroy the Russian nation. In their view, Putin is destroying the Russian nation, which, to a certain level, you might actually agree with him. What he's doing now is setting the country on a course of total disaster. And so in their view, he has been put there on purpose, and so one of his agents is Medvedev, the prime minister, with whom he's switching seats all the time, but also Kadyrov, the Chechen leader, who is, this rogue leader in Chechnya who's doing the dirty work for Moscow, right? And who has now his fighters in the eastern part of Ukraine liberating Ukrainian territory from the Judeo-Banderovцы. So you get a completely deformed vision of the world, actually. And it's very much stimulated by the media. Old-style reactions. This one I like very much. The foreign state of Russia is upset about the foreign interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine by more foreign states. Right? It's a special way of thinking, but it's very Soviet, because the general Soviet reaction, if you have criticism, was, well, sorry, but that's interfering in internal affairs of the Soviet Union. No difference now. Okay. Second is this concept of the world is all against us. Right? Again, here we see a very clear continuation from Soviet times. The books on the left-hand side, CIA Target to USSR, Chuzovo Golosa, they're books that were published in Soviet times about how we, anti-Sovietchiki, together with the CIA, were destroying the Soviet Union. Right? Exactly the same books are now being published. And the authors are even the same. One of the main authors is this guy on the photo, which is Philip Botkov. He was head of the Dissidents Directorate, the Piotr Directorate of the KGB. And if you now go to Dom Knigi, there is this whole wall with books about how the West is destroying Russia, using Lithuania as a base, or using people like me, you know, supporting the Judeo-Badirovцы. You know, it's the same mechanism, and it's the same story, and it's the same type of language, right? And it's the same idea. The world is against us. We are being, you know, threatened by an external conspiracy. In September last year, Putin gave a keynote address at, you know, this is an annual kind of gathering of experts on Russia from Russia and abroad at Volvay, which is a place between St. Petersburg and Moscow. And he gave a keynote address which actually, if you read it now, points out exactly what he's doing right now. Right? And it kind of bypassed because it's August, as you say in Dutch, it's the cucumber time, and nobody is really interested in what's happening. But he very clearly put himself on the line of the Slavophile, you know, positioning, which means that we need to stay away from Western values. The West is a totally demoralized Sodom and Gomorrah, which is trying to impose its liberal, destructive ideas on us. We take our own route, but that's not all. We, as Russians, we are a selected nation. We have a special mission in history. We are different. You know, we are the gendarme of Europe. When things go wrong, it's us Russians who come in and we solve the situation. And how do we solve it? By sending in our peacekeepers. Right? So, if you take this and put it into the Ukrainian situation, these bandits, which are now in Donbass, are the peacekeepers of Russia. Right? This is the peacekeepers that we're talking about. Right? But this is also the example of the higher level of, you know, our nationhood. And so Putin has a very clear philosophy. And it's a philosophy which is very strongly supported by a lot of the Slavophile philosophers in Russia, which is supported by the Russian Orthodox Church, and it is supported by the national Bolsheviks, the neo-fascists in Russian society. Because there is no country in Europe which has a bigger fascist movement than Russia itself. Right? Putin himself very much reminds us of Mussolini. Benito Mussolini, the Italian leader who thought that he would reinstitute the Roman Empire. You know, the interesting thing is, why did Germany lose the Second World War? Because they entered the Soviet Union only in June instead of in March, April. And why they came 2 months later? Because this guy thought that he could conquer Greece and got totally in a mess, and the Germans had to come in and help him. Right? So they lost several months. A lost leader, a fake, total fake. And Putin is, in his behavior and his, you know, his way of positioning himself, very similar to Mussolini. This is no joke. This is a photo of April this year. And there was a demonstration in Moscow against the occupation and annexation of the Crimea. What Putin puts against is his neo-fascist, right? It's military groups which were demonstrating in favor of Russia as a great nation. And they're all in red jackets. On the back of the jackets there is the map of the Soviet Union, and it says USSR 2.0, in other words, the second USSR, right? And they're very similar to the SR in Nazi Germany. The only difference is, in the SR in Nazi Germany, people used to call B-states. They called them B-states because on the outside they were brown in fascist, costumes. On the inside they were red because most of them were former communists, right? In this case, it's turned around B-states. And on the outside they're red, but their behavior is very fascist. On the inside they're brown. Criminal government. This is some of the jokes that were posted on the internet. How to steal every day and stop being worried, and how to make people servile to you. And this one is the tattoo of the word of Zakonio, the thieves in law. This is Vova, Putin, and there the three church cupola means that he is serving his third term as president, of course. Right? And indeed, very much related to the bikers, who he also sent to Crimea to help to get that part of Ukraine annexed to Russia, signing agreement with, for instance, Aksyonov, the so-called Prime Minister of Crimea, who is just a bandit, he's a gang leader. He has been involved in gang murders. There are at least 2-3 murders that are on his list. And it's not only Putin who's giving medals to these bikers, but it's even the church, which is doing exactly the same. Imagine 2 weeks ago, the church gave a medal to Zhuganov, the leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Right? Just honor and valor is the title of the medal. Very nice. Another joke. If in Russia they would amputate hands for thievery, for voting in the Duma they would install pedals instead of buttons. Because everybody's stealing, nobody would have hands anymore. These are photos of the leaderships of the two people's republics in Ukraine. On the left-hand side is Luhansk. On the right-hand side is Donetsk. Yeah, you don't need any comment, right? Just look at the faces, you understand what you're dealing with. This is one of the, I think, fundamental misunderstandings in the West. They're talking about separatists, about uprising against the central government. Excuse me, these are mafia gangs which are fighting for mafia territory. It has nothing to do with separatism. No. It's just fighting for money. And I think, to a large degree, the whole Crimean issue is exactly the same. Because why they wanted the Crimea? First of all, gas and oil. And secondly, Crimea is the main route for the narco trade. Right? And who is involved in the narco trade? Which is the Kremlin. So this is their territory. It's thievery. It's gangs. Okay. Getting to Ukraine. Ukraine so far had 4 presidents. Number 5 is now in power. Kravchuk, Kuchma, Yushchenko, and Yanukovych. I think of these 4, the most destructive one is actually Yushchenko. Much more than Yanukovych. Yanukovych is a weak guy, kind of out of this world, very good in stealing, but for the rest, not very much around him. This guy was stealing exactly the same. But he was also stealing something very important. He came to power after the Orange Revolution in 2004, and he stole the hope of the population that something would change, right? And so it's money stealing, and it's also conscience, dignity stealing. And so I think in history, Yushchenko actually will go down as being much worse than Yanukovych. And he basically prepared the grounds for Yanukovych to continue the stealing process. Well, we've seen a lot about corruption in Ukraine. It's endless. The Yanukovych family alone has stolen, as they now assess, about 77 billion, right? Interestingly, a month ago, the general procuracy in Kiev found out that property of Yanukovych was still being shipped out from Borispil airport in Kiev. So they were wondering, how is it possible that, you know, the guy is gone and still his stuff is being sent out? Turns out that the company is owned by Yanukovych. So, you know, his company is shifting out the stuff from there directly. Nothing bad about it. But if you then understand that they stole 77 billion, how much has been stolen in Russia? Right? Personal property of Putin assessed at 130 billion, one person. So it's a vast amount of stealing that goes beyond every imagination. Some photos from Medjugorje. If you now go to Maidan, one of the favorite souvenirs is this loaf of bread. Right? It's a golden loaf of bread, which was, we now know, given by the factory director from Sumy to Yanukovych. And you can buy them small, but you can also buy them in real size with a kind of sleeve in it, so you can put in money. It's a money collector. Yeah? He had his own vodka. I have my vodka in Estonia again. He has his vodka Yanukovych. Some jokes. Very nice ones. Especially the right one I like. Son, you got yourself into bad company. Ma, I organized it myself. Right? Okay, so we get to message 3. A lot of people still think Maidan was about the choice between East and West. It was not. Maidan, and this became clear already at the beginning of December, was about something very much more. It was an issue about dignity. It started with beating up students who were demonstrating in favor of the accession agreement to the European Union, but very quickly it turned into a campaign of the first post-Soviet generation against a government of whatever color that is stealing and doesn't care shit about the country. Right? It's a national uprising. And I think the energy of Maidan could only turn into this energy because it was actually a young generation that got out on the street and demonstrated, and they took everybody else along. There is a very nice interview with a Russian music critic, Artyom Troitsky, who now emigrated to Estonia because of the political situation. He was at Maidan in January. He comes back to Moscow, is being interviewed by Dorst, the television channel, and he asks him, well, Artyom, who, according to you, is the real hero? And they are referring to the 3 guys on stage that were all the time there, Klitschko, Tagnyvuk, and Yatsenyuk. And he says, no, for me, the hero is this 16-year-old girl, which is standing there every day in the front row at Maidan, minus 20, Ukrainian flag around her shoulders, and she's demonstrating for the country. That's the real hero. And this is exactly what carried Maidan. It was people who didn't care whether it's East or West. Just stop stealing. Just stop fooling us. You're robbing our country. And they just stood up and they refused to accept it. Maidan itself, it became bigger and smaller in size depending on the text by Berkut. This is the map in the maximum size. This here is Maidan. This is Institutska, where a lot of the killings took place, and on the far out corner is Rusheskova, where the first people were shot in January 2014. And as I said, it started with students demonstrating and being beaten up in a very vicious way by police. People were just shocked. It never happened in Ukraine. Ukraine was a very kind of kind, soft country. Yeah, sometimes, like Ungadze, a journalist was killed under the rule of Kuchma, but in general, Ukraine was really very kind of easygoing in comparison to other countries. So one of the posters that was put up is this one on the post office, Vitya, beat your own children. Right? These are photos I made in December. It's before the first major attack on Maidan. It's in the city hall, which turned into a combination of sleeping places for Maidanovci. On the right-hand side was one of the surgical rooms where operations were being carried out. It was the headquarters, and it was the collection point for material support to the Maidanovci. And I must tell you, for years and years and years, people in Ukraine have been telling me, well, don't think about volunteers, don't think about charitable support from society. People don't care. Everybody lives for themselves. What changed is, in this case, everything that happened is because of popular support. And actually, if you now look at the war in the East, the only reason why the Ukrainian army is effective is because it is supported by the people, not by the armed forces, because it's a complete mess. The people are fed by ordinary people. Mothers go to the front with their sons to make sure that they're being fed when they fight with these terrorists. Right? It's the ordinary people which are actually supporting it. And I remember one night in February we went to, you have these big warehouses or supermarkets for construction material, and we went to buy shoes and gloves for the Maidanovci. And the only people in the shop, this is a big one called the Bricolage, French firm, but the only people in the shop were actually shopping there for Maidan, right? So we go to the booths and we buy all the boots that are there. And then two other guys come and shit, they already took the boots, then we will go for the gloves. And so everybody was picking out whatever they needed, and outside we were kind of putting it into separate cars, driving it to Maidan, and this is how the whole system kept on going. It's the, grannies sitting in the metro with firewood, bringing it to Maidan. Even sitting with used tires in the metro in order to bring it to Maidan. Absolutely unbelievable. And initially, the atmosphere was very kind of gay. It was kind of free zone. It was the most safe spot in Kiev. And you could take at midnight your kids of 5 years old to Maidan, and you were sure nothing would ever happen. And because all the entry points were being checked by Afghani, veterans from Afghanistan, Ukrainian and Russian, and they were picking out everybody that they didn't like. Alcohol was absolutely forbidden, and it was fantastic, absolutely fantastic environment. Initially, Yanukovych responded with restrictive laws, very much similar to the laws that were introduced in Russia. One of the laws was that if you had more than 5 cars in a row, it was a demonstration, and then you could be arrested, right? So what happened is that cars like this one wrote on the back, "Don't drive after me because I'm already number 5." And then in December 11, it's the first big attacks on Maidan, which are repelled. And then, things really become much more kind of a war zone. The barricades go up to 6 meters. It's minus 20 degrees. So you have special battalions which are cutting the ice from Maidan in order to fill the bags and in order to build the barricades. And it's very interesting how things were being divided. Some of the brigades for building barricades were people in wheelchairs, cutting the ice on the sidewalks. Women were sitting in the so-called cocktail bars, making the Molotov cocktails. You had the kitchen, you had the library, you had the university. Everything was organized in a very organized fashion, very clean, actually. And it's also the time when the propaganda on the Russian side starts, right? To depict Maidan as right-wing, Banderovci, Pravy sector. Actually, I saw very few Banderovci and Pravy sector at Maidan. And actually, if I look at the behavior of Pravy sector, I'm pretty convinced that Pravy sector is actually a provocation by Moscow, right? It was organized on purpose in order to create trouble. Very nice one. Demonstrations up to 1 million people, and then the first channel of Russian TV saying, well, there are a few thousand people at Maidan, and so immediately on the internet disappears, we are not here, right? Нас тут нет. Another very nice one, the daily schedule of a Maidan activist. Those who know Russian, no need to translate, but some of the things is I'm going in the metro and go to the American embassy to pick up money. Then I go to Maidan to feed myself free of charge and pee against the building of the city hall. Then I turn over the Lenin statue. Then I engage myself in limitless homosexual relationships, which brings me one step closer to Europe. I beat up Russian women and kids. Then I pray to the statue of Bandera. I put swastikas on the wall. I sing the American national hymn. I go to the Russian embassy to steal their Wi-Fi. I steal Russian gas. Then I eat sala, and then I go home with vodka, and then I go to bed. And the next day exactly the same. Right? This is actually, if you follow the Russian media in those days, this is very much the image that was created. And then at the end of January, you see things are turning bad. And I think one of the things is, this is a stalemate, nothing is moving. Maidan has become a totally impossible fortress, impossible to take, unless you really want to go for a big kill. And so there are attacks, and on purpose, 2 people are killed. These two, Sergei Nigoyan, Armenian refugee from Nagorno-Karabakh, and a guy from Belarus, and they are killed with these bullets. They're this big. These are bullets with which you kill horses and elephants, right? And they are shot at them from very close range, about 2 meters. So it's killing on purpose. And the hope is probably that by killing several of them, people will get scared or something will change. And this is, I think, a fatal mistake of Yanukovych and his buddies, because it has a totally alternative reaction. This makes people much more determined, because now they're not going anywhere anymore, right? And I felt myself to what extent people were just accepting the risk of being killed. Just ordinary citizens. Right? Not only, fighters who already, were all with helmets, etc., but just ordinary citizens who were going to Maidan knowing that there was a risk of being killed, and still going there every day. It becomes almost like northern France. It's a maze of trenches, of barricades. This is a photo I made from a live stream. These barricades were built, I think, in 4 or 5 hours. This is a Hushevskova, and it's a camera which was showing from one of the buildings, and it's like you're looking at these ants, which are all moving around, all with these bags, and very quickly the whole thing is built up. Medical services. If there are heroes at Maidan, it's the medical services. We're talking about people who were out at the front line. Very often students who were seeing horrible things, who were right there being shot at on purpose by Berkut, because with the Red Cross, Berkut was shooting deliberately on the Red Cross, and they were pulling out the wounded and bringing them to the medical stations. The current count is that probably about 9,000 people were wounded at Maidan. Right? So it's not only the 100 people that were killed, 9,000 people were actually wounded at the whole period. Right? This one, it's a coffee bar at Maidan, which was the Operativnaya. This is where surgery was carried out. Right? And on the 20th of February, it's downstairs in the lobby of Hotel Ukraina that they are operating on wounded Maidanovцы. While on the 8th and the 9th floor, the sharpshooters are shooting them. It's an unbelievable situation. One in the same building. There's some photos of the medical teams. Really heroic. They had their own university to keep people busy. They had their own library. Initially, it was a big library in the Dom Profsayuzov, in the trade union building. Then that building burned down, and the whole library disappeared, and they started building a new one in the Ukrainian house, Ukrainsky Dim. But also what starts to emerge is a disenchantment with the political leaders. Every day these three guys appear on stage and there is no movement, nothing is happening. Somehow they have no idea how to move the political stalemate and to get something to a conclusion. And so there is this, I wouldn't say volcano, but there is this frustration which is starting to develop stronger and stronger at Maidan itself. Okay, now I need to go into some different type of technology, if it works. Just a minute. One of the people at Maidan who had an enormous influence is this winner of the Eurovision Song Festival, Ruslanna. Every night she would come on stage and she would sing the national anthem. What I will show you now is Ruslanna on the night before the killings of February the 20th. In the morning she has been in Strasbourg. She has been speaking to the members of the European Parliament about asking for support. She flies into Kiev, straight to Maidan, and she appears on stage. And you can see more or less, what kind of climate this developed. A minute. This is, just a minute. This is on the square on the 19th. It's 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. So this is about 4 hours before the shooting starts, right? And half of the square is occupied by Berkut, and the only way they manage to keep them out is by having these piles of tires which are on fire, with the smoke keeping away the snipers. And I will show you later another film which I made exactly, well, half an hour later than this, and you hear the snipers, you hear the grenades, and everybody is just standing there. Everybody understands what is happening, and there's nobody who's moving. It's an absolutely unbelievable atmosphere. Right? These are some photos the same night. This is this trade union house which burned down right on the corner of Maidan. This is a photo from February the 20th, during the fight in which about 100 people were killed. This is what they call the cocktail bar, right? It's mainly women who are making the Molotov cocktails, which are then taken to the front line. And up there is Khрешат. And that photo up there on the right-hand side, everybody who was going to Maidan would write their telephone number and the name on their arm in order to make sure that if something would happen to you, you would be, they would find some way of identifying you. Okay, so this is another video I want to show you. Just a minute. This one. This was going on all the time. This was going on all the time, these kind of war songs on the stage in order to keep the atmosphere going. The strange thing is, of course, the front line was like at the end of this room from here, with all the people standing up there, and what you now know is that some of the people that were standing there were actually killed the next morning, right? Because it's those who went straight up Institutska, right into the fire line. Let me see how I can get this out of the way. Yeah. This is a photo I made. It's about 10 o'clock in the morning. This is on Maidan. And there in the distance you see the fight, the smoke, which is Institutska, where at that moment the fighting is going on. And the building behind this monument here, this is Hotel Ukraina, where from the 8th floor the snipers are shooting, and at the same time downstairs they're trying to save people. Most of the people that were killed were shot in the neck. On purpose, because you hit the aorta and people just bleed to death. So very few of them actually survive. That's one of the medical stations here, this one. Okay, this is a video which shows you a little bit what happened on Institutska. It's not a long way, it's 100 meters, and people had to go up a hill in the direction of the governmental buildings, and that's where the Berkut was waiting for them, and the sharpshooters. Okay, let me see, this one. Just a minute, something is wrong with the image. Now it's okay, yeah?
truck is wanted! Is wanted! Help! Medics! Medico! Medico! It's fucking wanted!
So you see, you saw the medics in what kind of situations they were, trying to save people. Let's go down.
The next one.
Why doesn't he want?
Ah,
this one.
This one.
Yeah. So, this is duck shooting, right? And if you look at the protection that they had, some of the shields that they had were made of plywood. Even with just a hammer you would go through, let alone bullets. And the bullets that were used were sniper bullets which go through battle gear of the 4th category. So there is absolutely no way people could survive this. And I remember myself when we went to, on Maidan, on that morning, I had this blue helmet all the time, and so I said to my companion, hey, Dima, let's put on the kaska. He said, what kaska? It doesn't make any sense. And the interesting thing is, everybody just stayed there. Nobody left. And you hear the snipers in the distance, and everybody understands that you can be the next, and there's absolutely nobody who gets out. So the determination to stay there and win was just unbelievable. And this is the evening after the shooting. Everywhere new barricades are being built up, using anything, old cars. And again, here you see behind the barricade the new cocktail bar appearing, right? And this is, the traces. You can still, if you go to Maidan, you can see the traces of the shooting, sometimes going straight through lampposts. So you can imagine what kind of bullets were being used, right? And then something miraculous happens. Because the 3 guys, Yanukovych, Klitschko, Yatsenyuk, and Tagnibok, they are negotiating under aegis of the European Union with Yanukovych, and they come on stage and say, well, we have a deal. Yanukovych is going to leave the country by the end of the year, and then we will have presidential elections. And there is this kind of emotion among the people at the square that, listen, we lost 100 guys today. And he's going to sit there, and everybody is in total shock. And then suddenly a guy climbs up on stage. He is one of the Maidanцы, absolutely unexpected, unplanned, and he stands in front of the political leaders, and then you see this. And this is extraordinary, because, you see, in particular, Klitschko standing there like, holy moly, what is happening here? And there is a guy, apparently on Bankoska, who watches this, who understands that now it's going to be dangerous, and he gets out. And this appearing on stage is the end of the rule of Yanukovych. Within hours, he's gone. And then the next morning, suddenly Berkut is, disappeared. Everything disappeared. And the whole territory is over. And it turns that Maidan actually managed to achieve what it wanted to achieve. This is some photos in the Ukrainian house, the museum, of the stuff that they used to defend. And you can see the plywood shield that they were using. And then for a long period, there are funerals at Maidan. And it's a very special kind of atmosphere, because it starts with the 77 people who were killed on that one day. They have one communal funeral at Maidan, and then they are taken to their hometowns. And then people start dying in hospital who survived the first day, and every dead person is taken to Maidan and said farewell at Maidan itself. This is a photo about a week after Maidan. I come out of the metro, and you know, by the sounds you already understand in what you're entering. And here's one of the victims being taken from Maidan and said farewell. Right? Everywhere memorials and photographs of those who were killed on the spots where they were shot. Many of them behind trees, trying to hide from the sniper bullets. What I want to show you is a very nice film, which one of the initiatives at Maidan made. It's called Babylon 13, and they made films about everything that happened there. And this is a film they made about this collective funeral during the February the 21st. Let me see if I can get it quickly. Yeah.
Hey,
You know, the interesting thing is, if you look at the fighters in the East, the most successful elements in fighting, there are actually two categories. One is the National Guard. And the National Guard consists of Maidanovцы, mainly. So, you know, when Maidan was over, or the fight was over, there was a very clever decision what to do with the 10,000 Maidanovцы. And they were induced into the National Guard, and they were sent to the East. And these are people who have been there, and who have seen this, and so they understand very well what they're fighting for, right? The second category is the SBU, the former KGB. They are very effective in collaborating together with the National Guard and in making the advances. The Ukrainian army as such is a complete mess, but these are the two strong parts, right? I know one boy, he is now near Slavyansk. He was at Maidan, got wounded in January at Lyshevskovo by a grenade and was hiding somewhere in the cellar. And the daughter of one of my friends rescued him during the night. And the guy is now in the National Guard. And it's amazing because, you know, he never had anything with the military. He's small, he's thin, he's smaller than Putin. And he has this helmet which is 3 times bigger than his head. But these are the guys which are actually fighting at the front and trying to defend their country. Because for them, this has become their country. Finally, they have the sense that this is their country and it's worth fighting for. I think one of the questions which is very interesting is what the position is of Maidan in the history. And I think there is some kind of similarity to the events in Vilnius in January 1991, or maybe even April here at Rustaveli in April 1989. It's the cracks in the wall when things start to fall apart. Right? A very important element is the issue of the Russians. I have many friends in Russia, and the whole time they're telling me, oh, we can't go to Maidan because we will be beaten up. Oh, we can't go to Maidan because we will be killed, because this is what the media has been telling us. Actually, at Maidan there were quite a lot of Russians. There were tents which were full with Russians, Russian sotnyas. There were Russian Afghansi defending Maidan against, you know, people infiltrating from outside. And I think one of the key speeches that was taking place at Maidan is the one by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, which is about, well, a week or two after the killings at Institutska. And I want to show you part of his presentation, because it has a very important message.
Российская пропаганда, как всегда, врет. Здесь нет фашистов и нацистов, точнее их не больше, чем на улицах Москвы или Питера. Мне рассказали и показали, что здесь сделала власть. Она это делала с согласия российской власти. Больше сотни убитых, больше 3000 или 5000 раненых. Я видел те фанерные щиты, с которыми здесь стояли против автоматных пуль. Плакать хотелось. Это страшно. Это не моя власть. Я хочу, чтобы вы знали, есть совсем иная Россия.
One of the key elements of what happened in Ukraine in this period, I think, is that the rules of the game have changed fundamentally. I I've been involved in human rights work in Russia since the late 1970s. In the 1980s, I knew exactly what could happen to me. The maximum was, arrest, being kicked out of the country, show trial, several years, exchange for foreign spies, right? But in general terms, physically, very little chance that anything would happen to me. And this is totally different now. Because what happened at the beginning of Maidan is that suddenly people started to disappear. They would be found back tortured. They would be found back in forests, frozen to death. Or they would never be found back. And there are still more than 100 people that disappeared at Maidan, and their bodies were never found. And so what we see is what I call a Latin Americanization of the situation. It's death escadrons. People that are being taken off the street and they disappear forever. Or like, as I said, a pilot of the Ukrainian Air Force winding up in a prison in Voronezh, abducted to a foreign country. People being beaten up in all possible ways. This is Chernobyl, the journalist, Bulatov, one of the activists of the Automaidan. Really horrible things. You see there shooting on purpose in the neck to try to hit the artery. So things are not the same again, and I don't think they will come back. And I think the message for the human rights movement in Russia is a very gory one, very unpleasant one. Because it's not the same type of regime anymore that they're dealing with. They're dealing with a fascist regime. And the only way that fascist regime is going to be removed is by force. Which means that the only way it will disappear is if there is a civil war in Russia. And you understand that the civil war in Russia will not be contained only to Russia itself. It's a very serious danger to the European constellation. And I think far too few people understand what is actually happening, transpiring before our eyes. And this is one of our friends, Andrei Mironov, former political prisoner, who was a stringer working with an Italian journalist at Slavyansk, served 7 years in the Gulag, was found dead in Slavyansk with his head blown off. Right? All the time people are talking about the civil war in Ukraine. Because in a way, after 23 years, finally the country has started. It is a new starting point. And the starting point is that, this is all the time being told, Единая страна, we are one country. East and West doesn't make a difference. The big problem is that for 23 years the government didn't do anything to turn it into a Единая страна. In Kiev they didn't care what was going on in the East. They hardly cared what was going on in the Crimea, apart from the fact that they went on holiday over there. And the communication between East and West was almost non-existent. So in that sense, it is not a coincidence that is happening, what is happening right now. I remember in March last year, I met one of the deputy heads of the SBU, Gerasimenko, former general of the Piatый Directorate of the Ukrainian KGB, and he showed me the trunk of his car, which was full of books. And he told me that every second weekend he would go to the East to deliver books about Ukrainian history to schools and libraries, because people in the East have no idea to which country they belong. So for 23 years, the country just let it fall apart. And it's a miracle that they have actually a second chance. Right? So there is massive work which needs to be done over here. One is reconciliation. There are so many people that have been killed. There are so many families that have been destroyed. There are so many false images that have been created by propaganda which need to be restored, that this is something that will take a long time, if not generations, before you can restore trust and the feeling of a national unity. So what needs to be done is to invest in the East and to try to help people to understand that actually they are wanted in the Ukrainian environment. Right? Memory needs to be preserved of what happened. And not only the memory of the Maidanovцы, but of everybody who suffered during the period, and also those who are suffering right now. And a very important issue is the independent Russian language media. because 20 million people in Ukraine speak Russian as their mother tongue. So they deserve to have their media, independent media, in their own language. And here you see all the time the same problem appearing. Initially it was kind of a lack of understanding on the part of people in Kiev that why this Russian is so important. And now very often the reaction that we get is, but why should we do something in the language of the oppressor? Right? So the language of Russia. Well, excuse me, you have 20 million citizens who speak Russian, they're yours. And somehow this understanding that you have a country with two languages equal is very difficult to put in place. Go to Switzerland, you have 4 languages. Who cares? Everybody is an equal citizen. But this is something which will take a long time to establish. So psychological support is necessary in the country. We're now looking at 140,000 refugees, of which about 80,000 fled to Russia. But now many of them are coming back because they're dissatisfied of what they get in Russia, and they're going through Ukraine in the direction of Belarus. Right? And Belarus, of course, is a very interesting country because Lukashenko is a very clever bastard. Knows exactly what game to play. And as we know, Putin has declared that he will defend Russian speakers wherever they are in the world. And Lukashenko is now speaking from the platform in Belarusian to make sure that we have a different language, so no need to save us. Right? We are working on a program of oral history to preserve the memory of Maidan, interviewing and Maidanovцы and people who were there on the outside, but hopefully eventually also members of Berkut and of the internal army to get the full picture of what happened. And one of the things we're working on is try to develop a concept for a monument at Maidan, which is not a Soviet-style big thing, but actually a educational type of, modest educational type of thing, which helps the nation to understand what happened, but also to use this as a way of building a nation and to create a sense of unity. Right? And our idea for the memorial is like here. This is Maidan and Institutska, is to have a memorial on one side of Institutska leading to a museum, and to have a park and a memorial square on both sides in order to unite all the elements of the place where everything happened. There are many examples. This is Yad Vashem, I think one of the most imposing memorials that you can imagine, with the photographs of some of the victims of the Holocaust. And the wall that we are envisioning on Institutska is very similar to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, with the names of the people that were killed. And our idea is that the names of those that were killed in the war in the East will also be at Maidan in order to show the connection to the people, that it's all one and the same. And then the attempt to develop Russian independent media, which I think is a key element. And to give you an example how complex this is, this photo on the right-hand side is the competition for a memorial at Maidan, which has been announced by the Ministry of Culture. It's only in Ukrainian, right? It's not in Russian, as if the Russian-speaking part has no ideas what kind of memorial should be built, and it's not in English. So it's, it's very narrow-minded provincial type of thinking which needs to be broken out. And it will take a long time before people start to understand that, if you want to build a strong society, it's exactly this unity which is a key element. That's it. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yeah?
Hi, I have a question about the last slide that you had about the Russian media. Is it going to be online media or something TV? Because what's the internet penetration, for example? What's the internet penetration rate in Eastern Ukraine?
Well,
if it's online.
The development is it's all kind of a gradual process. We started with this oral history program. Actually, we started with the oral history program in February, as a way to help the medical services at Maidan. Because we were seeing a large number of people who had seen horrible things, and without any system of helping them to deal with their nightmares and the horrible things they've been seeing. And our idea is if we start, interviewing them, it gives them the chance to get rid of their stories, and for us, we record what is actually happening here. And so this is now a program. We have interviewed by now about 50 people, up to 8 hours per person on video. There's another 190 waiting to be interviewed, so it's really getting bigger. And then we started working on this memorial, physical memorial at Maidan, and we realized that, if I'm living in Buenos Aires or in Toronto or in Sydney, what is my chance ever of getting to Kiev? So why not create a virtual Maidan, a virtual museum, a 3D one, a second life. So we are in the process of actually doing one and the same. So it's very interesting. We are working with gamers. I don't know if you ever spoke to gamers, but they speak a totally different language than you and me. It's very complex to talk to them, but it's also very, stimulating because they're very interesting ideas. And so what we are trying to do is create something which eventually will be on the internet, and that you can walk on Maidan in the several stages of Maidan and go into the museum, see the museum, but then also use it as a portal for all the initiatives that are there. So it's an endless project.
I have one more question. About Sloboda, can you talk a little bit about their involvement in Maidan?
Sure. Well, you're talking about Sloboda, you're talking about Pravi Sector, the right wings, right?
Yeah. And if they are really as fascist as the European left
you get in a very interesting situation. Sloboda has connections with the Front National in France, has connections with Jablok in Hungary, with right-wing parties in Western Europe. At the same time, the same parties have a very good buddy sitting in Moscow, Putin. Right? It's exactly the same people that Putin feels very much at home with. So it's almost impossible to understand this combination. If you look at political opinion polls in the country, 1.5% max their support. And if I look at Maidan through the period, very few of them present in quantity. Right? They're there. Bandera is also there, poster, Pravi Sector is there, but it's 1-2 tents in the whole sea of tents. On the whole, they have very little influence. I think one of the interesting things about Ukraine is that, the amount of right-wingism or anti-Semitism in the country is actually very small. From the very start. And I know from the early 90s with the Ukrainian government that they really had a very active program in combating anti-Semitism and in restoring the memory of the lost Jewish part of the country. Right? And yes, there are anti-Semites. It's very funny, my close friends are Jews, and they could point out exactly at Maidan which stalls are run by anti-Semites. And they know the guys, and the guys behind the stalls know them, and know that they're Jews, and they greet each other. It's because this is some part of what Ukraine used to have, a very kind of soft kind of political climate, which was very much destroyed by Maidan. But let's see what happens. But, the importance of right wing in Ukraine is very much overrated. Very much overrated, and as I said, I'm very much convinced that Pravi Sector is at least partially a provocation. There are several instances where it's very clear. There is, in March, at one time, there is an attack on the Verkhovna Rada by Pravi Sector. 10 minutes before Pravi Sector gets to Verkhovna Rada, Russian journalists are standing there waiting. Only Russian journalists. So how is it possible that Russian journalists know already 10 minutes in advance that they need to be there? Any other questions?
I was going to ask about the reaction of general public in Russia to whatever was happening in Ukraine. Of course, I don't believe in Holocaust's tears because he didn't have the same sentiments to us, the Georgians. But there are some people, for example, Alana Pugacheva, the pop star. As I recall, she said that Ukrainians and Russians share the same blood and they belong to the same group, probably the Slavic group or something like that. And that's why she was really hurt that those killings were happening in Ukraine. And I just have a question. What if they didn't share the same blood and they didn't belong to the same, I don't know, Slavic group or something? Would they care? And why don't they care about Georgians? Because I can't recall the same compassion, if they had that compassion, of course, because I don't believe in their tears, as I said. Thank you.
You know, I have many friends in Russia, but of a particular background. Most of them are offsprings of the dissident movement, second generation kids from political prisoners, or people who were in the environment of the dissident movement. The majority of them are absolutely shocked. And I think actually a large portion of Russian society is shocked of what is happening because there's hardly any Russian who doesn't have family in Ukraine or Ukrainian blood in their veins. So I think what Putin is doing in Ukraine is really very dangerous because he's getting as close as possible to, going to the edge. What happens actually in the country is this kind of mass psychosis, right? Which is not very unusual. Look at in Germany when Hitler annexed Austria, Hitler had higher popularity ratings that Putin has right now. When Khomeini came to Tehran, look at the mass psychosis in Iran, where everybody was suddenly in favor of an Islamic State, which then started killing its own people, right? Michel Foucault, the well-known French philosopher, was saying that Khomeini was, a beacon of democracy. So, misunderstanding of the kind of political environment is something which is very human. And don't forget the effect of the bombardment of propaganda which is going on day in, day out, day in, day out, right? One of my friends in Peter sometimes calls me and said, Robert, I heard that, how is that possible? I said, question, listen, where did you hear it? Well, I was standing in the kitchen, I heard it on the radio. I said, no. Then everything is clear, not? Shit, I forgot it's Russian radio, right? It's this permanent bombardment which eventually has an effect. It's like drops of water on your school, you go crazy. I think there was an opinion poll in March in Russia. 2/3 of the population were willing to send their kids to Ukraine to be killed at the front fighting Ukraine. Right? 2 days ago there was an opinion poll. 2/3 of the Russians are against military operations in Ukraine. So there is a shift. There is a height of this mass hysteria, and it's slowly going down, and people are starting to realize. Who is paying for the Crimea? It's eventually the pensioners and the ordinary Russian population which is going to pay, not Putin. He's not saying, well, listen, I have 130 billion, so I will fill the gap in the budget. No, it's the ordinary people that are going to pay. So I think this is, it's a gradual phase to the edge of the abyss. I'm convinced that we will see in 10-15 years Maidans in Russia itself. My only fear is that the Maidan in Russia looks a little bit worse than the Maidan in Kiev. It's a different nation, it's a different culture, the vengeance, the ferocity is much different than it is in Ukraine. So it will be horrible. I'm absolutely convinced, and I think many people are actually now trying to get out of Russia because they understand what is going to happen. There's Artyom Troitsky, who's one of the few Russians who dare to speak out and say whatever he thinks. He's now in Estonia. He's out. My friend in Peter is trying to get out as quickly as possible. So what the people who actually should be the bulwark against this fascism, which is now happening, are leaving the country. So that's very bad news in a way. It's understandable, but it's very bad news. Does that answer your question? Yeah?
I have one question. So actually you have emphasized, especially in case of Russia, the role of individuals. And Putin is kind of the #1 player in this game. So I have a question like this. So do you think that the individual and the Putin's personal traits, his experience as a KGB, his KGB experience, is kind of the most important factor here, not only in case of the Maidan, but let's say in case of the whole Russia's approach to the post-Soviet space. So to put it in different words, can you think that whether the individual is Putin or something else there matters actually? So is this about personal traits of these people, or is there something like the more objective interest of the Russian state? Then this interest is to preserve this influence over the post-Soviet world. So do the individuals matter more than, let's say, so-called state interests?
Okay. I think it's a combination of factors. One is Russia is a lost imperium and has a big problem in dealing with the fact that they are not an imperium. They're not the only ones. Look at the French, right? They still think that they can send the Légion d'honneur to Africa to solve problems in their part of Africa. They still think that that's absolutely no problem to sell the Mistral boats to Russia, because they have this idea of grandeur, of la France, la grande France, right? So this is a basis on which the Putin regime is building. And by using this patriotism, he manages to get a lot of support in society. Secondly, I think his rule is very much based on Sovietism. It's the continuation of the Soviet regime. But then, in Soviet times, you had the Communist Party, and the strong arm of the Communist Party was the KGB. The KGB is now the party. Forget about the Communist Party, they are now the party. The country is ruled by the KGB. It's a KGB state. As far as the position of Putin is concerned, it's very interesting. Sometimes every now and then, via, you get stories from the inside. One of the stories is that when the second layer of sanctions was called off by the West, or imposed by the West, there was a lot of criticism that these sanctions, they're very small and they don't have any effect. They had a major effect. And it's not so much that there are so many people that are being affected by it, but everybody's afraid that they're the next. So, it's an earthquake in trust in the fact that the money that you stole, you can actually use. And what I heard from the inside is that a lot of people around Putin started saying, well, listen, Wolf, we have this money. Now, who says that we can use this money still? So, and why? Crimea, yes, it's ours, but these bandits from eastern Ukraine, why do we need bandits from eastern Ukraine? We have our own bandits, right? So they just don't understand anymore what he is fighting for. And he has gone onto a track from which he cannot return. He pushed himself in a position where any withdrawal from this position is loss of face. So now in the case of Ukraine, when things go really very wrong and he's not able to get the eastern provinces, I'm pretty sure that, on the shelf there is already plan C or D or X or Y, which is destabilization. I would not be surprised if in several months from now there are terrorists arriving on the coast via the Black Sea, and they start trouble in Odessa, or they start trouble in Mariupol. Because the main thing for him now is to make sure that Ukraine is not able to get itself off the ground as a stable country. Because it's mortal danger. A Slavic country, Russian-speaking, democratic, aligned with Europe, for Putin this is the ultimate nightmare. So he will go to the edge. And I think at a certain moment there are two possibilities. Either they will go along with him because there is no alternative, or he will be removed by a palace revolution and somebody else comes to power. But my fear is that the next will be even worse than Putin. So it's a nightmare scenario in every respect. A month ago I was at a conference organized by the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Vilnius. It was a closed conference. There were about 30 people invited from Russia, from Ukraine, from Western Europe, and from the United States. So from Russia, Troitsky was there, Ilya Romanov, Pyotr Gorsky. The outcome was two things, very clear, almost unanimous. First of all, Russia now is in the same position as Nazi Germany in 1938-39. Secondly, the only way to solve this problem is to get Russia to the situation of Nazi Germany in 1945, which means the country needs to collapse, disintegrate, and then start building anew, because unless you get to that point, it will all the time remain a danger for its survival. Not very pleasant message, but very realistic, I think.
You mentioned your friend who is willing to bring in Eastern Ukraine the historic textbook or history books and teach them what is Ukraine and image and reconstruct the past, the united past, let's say, in that way. And how do you imagine the other ways of creating the sense of unity between the West and Western and Eastern Ukraine, and some kind of create a new Ukraine? And this is a process of national building, and what are other ways to achieve this goal?
Well, I wouldn't call this guy my friend. You know, I'm open-minded, but to call a former general from the Piotr Directorate of the KGB my friend is, you know, there is a certain limitation there. Right? He's very intelligent, and I understand what he's saying, and he helped me a lot in trying to understand what happened in Soviet times. He saw things working at the SBU, which they saw because the SBU was apparently in that sense functioning, right? They saw the problem appearing in the East. I think what is vital is programs focusing on the young generation. One of my old friends in Ukraine is a former political prisoner, Miroslav Marinovich, who served, God knows, 12 years. He is now the vice dean of the Catholic University in Lviv. And in January he says, you know, Robert, actually, we never did any exchange programs with the East. You know, our students never went to Donetsk or to Luhansk. Who wants to go to Donetsk? But we never had people from Donetsk come to Lviv to have a look at us, because, you know, who wants to go to Lviv? No? So these exchange programs, summer camps, things focusing especially at the young generation, giving them hope is, I think, an essential quality, right? And yes, Donbass is it's a very Soviet area with a Soviet mentality. It's dilapidated. A lot has now been destroyed. But every crisis gives a lot of opportunities. You can rebuild, and you can rebuild in a different way. And I think if the central government shows to the East that it's really willing to invest in the East and putting it on a different footing, this could have a major impact, right? Developing a Silicon Valley in the East, for instance. Not continue with this old-style Soviet, you know, big industries, but invest in a totally different way and get jobs to the young generation in the East. I think this is crucial. It's the best barrier against Russia that you can have. I think this, you know, there are lots of programs that you can think of, but I would focus on the young people, give them hope for a future. There is one, you know, I will tell you one funny story. One of these contacts in the National Guard told me a nice story. When they liberated Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, they were going through village and village. So they entered one village, right? And there's nobody there. And suddenly people start appearing from the houses. First old ladies, then younger people, and they're all like this at them. So they think, oh fuck, they don't like us. And they come to their tanks and to their armored personnel carriers, and they shout at them, where the fuck have you been? Why did it take so long? Go to them, get them out of here. So, a lot of people had exactly the same fear and kept silent as long as these guys are over there. So I think there is a base where you actually can build something.
So my question is, you described a pretty gloomy picture, right, overall, and what are the prospects of Georgia becoming, pro-European, Europe? What is, how Russia will behave in our efforts, how do you see this?
I think there are two possibilities. The positive side is that as long as Russia is busy with Ukraine, which is much bigger a threat to them than Georgia, they have less time to spend on Georgia, right? So the more they are busy over there, and Moldova, and there will be problems in Narva, you can be sure, Estonia, there will be problems in Latvia. Lithuania, I'm not sure. I think Lithuania is in that sense very nicely, has a very integrated Russian community. I can't see any big problems over there. But as long as they are looking to the west, they forget a little bit about the south. The other side is the arms that now came into Ukraine, very sophisticated arms, and as you know, probably some of the arms were from the Georgian army, which were captured by the Russians and now wind up in Slavyansk. The same arms can go easily back into Russia. And they will wind up in the hands of people in Ingushetia, Dagestan, maybe Crimea. So there are many more hot points coming in the country. And nobody knows how the central government will react to this and who they will blame for this. And so Georgia is in the risk zone all the time, I think permanently, until you get this scenario that the whole thing collapses inside the country itself. I think when working on this Russian language media, I was talking also to, for instance, the Russian service at BBC, and because they get a little bit upset, they say, well, we are already doing this. I said, well, but listen, you are not SWAI, you're BBC, it's foreign. That you need to have your own media stations over there. Why don't you concentrate on Bashkir and Tatar languages? Because I think this is very important, to stimulate these national minorities in Russia who are very strong in developing the national identity, because these are the ones who eventually the power of the Kremlin will bring down, right? So I think the big challenge is to have the country implode and not explode. Another very interesting thing to keep in mind is while Putin is busy here in Europe, the Chinese are nicely entering from the west and they're eating up the country. I have people who are living in Vladivostok, they say, well, we hardly see any Russians anymore. It's all Chinese and Japanese. Women in the West, they don't want to marry Russian men because they drink and they beat. They want Chinese men because they work and they bring money home and they don't beat as often. Right? So, this is really going to change the balance of power in the country.
So China is our hope.
That is an extrapolation I would not be very sure about. It's another threat, let's put it that way. Yeah.
Thank you first for the nice presentation. I'm interested in two parts. First, if I understand well, you mentioned about the education sphere and about that you are trying to evoke some fundraising to make a fund. Yeah? I'm interested how you are planning to do this way, and are you yourself included in this process, or are your friends doing this? Because first, I'm interested in another, some foundation in this fair, because in 3rd of July in in Georgia was the European Commission conference where was ambassador of Ukraine, and he's trying to study from our culture and the Ministry of Sport how to make a policies of occupation territory. And then testing what is your, for example, abilities can contribute in this sphere for helping, because some children also I have parents there who is a problem that they would like to their children go to some territory because it is a stress or something like this. And now the ministry and ambassador of Ukraine is trying to make some project. Maybe you are interested or how you can contribute to this or can devise this.
Well, in a way, I'm involved in different levels. Well, first of all, I need funding myself, right? So I'm looking for donors to carry out my project. At the same time, there are a number of kind of fundamental issues which need to be tackled. So, to give you some examples, first of all, with the European Commission, the European Commission has the crazy rule, and then I'm talking in particular about the Russian Federation, that projects that are in the field of human rights can only be funded if there is an NGO as a partner in Russia. If there is an NGO as a partner in Russia, it means they're a foreign agent, right? Because it's foreign money, which means that they will be closed down by the FSB within 6 months. So how, as a European Union, can you give money to human rights work knowing that those who take the money will immediately be closed down? It's ridiculous. It's a bureaucracy which has no understanding of reality. So we are trying to push this via the European Parliament to change this rule. And we are also trying to get money on the table for the third sector in Ukraine, which is not automatically channeled through authorities, because governmental structures in Ukraine are, corruption doesn't end from one day to the next. Second, as far as the East is concerned, because I think this is really a priority, for instance, with the UNDP, we are trying to develop a plan how to invest in the East. What kind of programs should be financed in the East in order to build this Yedinya Strana? And the interesting thing is that one of the top people of UNDP in Ukraine was working here in Tbilisi before, and we worked here a lot with her on developing mental health care services in Ukraine or in Georgia. So using old contacts in order to try to get things moving. So it's on one hand I'm looking for my own activities, but at the same time trying to help to build a kind of funding possibility for the whole civil rights sector. In order to be able to get things moving, to stimulate building this non-governmental sector in the country.
Thank you.
Anything else?